So
Hi,
kick off.
everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Jade Johnson. I'm one of the Associate Directors of College Counseling in the Hill College Counseling Office. So I have the pleasure of working with truly all of your students at this point. I also oversee all of our testing and testing partners. So we've partnered with Franklin Yard for the past few years. They're an excellent testing company that our students completely flock to. So it was a no-brainer for us when we'd ask them if they would come and kind of share some of the updates of what's going on with the digital SAT, which indefinitely will affect your student at some point. So I'm going to allow them to take it away. I'm just here for support. So thank you everyone for joining us. This will be recorded. So we will make sure that we'll have it posted on our site as well at some point or directing it to their site. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jay. All right, let me get this, do a little this. This. All right, can you guys see this? Sharon? Works. Okay, awesome. Hello, everybody. 40 people. Wow. Giving a talk about standardized testing to 40 people is like the tutor version of playing in Citizens Bank Park. This is an enormous crowd. So thanks for coming. Today we're going to be talking about the standardized testing survival guide, aka navigating the SAT and ACT. And more specifically, this is what our agenda looks like. So the state of standardized testing, very briefly, and then on everyone's mind, the upcoming digital SAT, then looking at the current state of things, comparing the SAT and ACT and understanding those scores, and then how to prepare. Like, what are the practical next steps that you guys can take to get started on this process? So a little bit about us. Jade mentioned we've been working with Hill students for the last couple of years through COVID. Interesting, great times, adventure, quite an adventure. Absolutely wonderful students here. I'm here every Sunday, actually, at the moment, teaching an SAT class. Collectively, me, myself, Josh, Tara, we're the sort of founding partners of Franklin Yard. We've been in education collectively for over 40 years and in test prep for over 20. Josh and I are kind of the nerd guys. And Tara is the normal one who talks to families and guides them through a lot of the aspects of this process. So what is going on with standardized testing? This is like one of the weirdest times. I don't know if you hopefully you've been blissfully unaware up to this point, but as somebody who's in test prep, it's been a really interesting time. Things are in flux to an extent that they haven't really been before, almost ever. So there's some big things right now on everyone's minds. One, and I'm just going to talk about this very briefly, there's the issue of test optional. So almost all schools are test optional at this point. Many schools are test optional at this point. So a question I still get is like, what is there a point to this at all? The answer is super complicated, and it's more of a college counselor question, to be frank. But to answer it as simply as possible, if you have good scores, there's still an incredible value add to your application. Now, what good scores means is complicated. All of this stuff depends on your college list, kind of the rest of your portfolio, et cetera, et cetera. So no real general answers here, but the tests are still very useful if you're able to do well. The other thing, as I alluded to, the SAT is going digital. Here's our little helpful diagram from College Board on the kind of phased rollout of this. Just this March, actually, international test takers took their first digital SAT. The folks that I've talked to actually said it went pretty well, which is a good sign. American test takers will take their first official test next spring, so it's a little while. but the PSAT this fall, if they take the PSAT this fall, will also be digital. All right, so let's get into this. So the digital SAT. Again, this is coming in March specifically of 2024. So we are living with the paper and pencil version of the test up through December. December is the last administration of it. It's digital in the sense that it's taken on a computer or tablet. Can't say I'd recommend a tablet, but apparently that's an option. Couple of things, possible misconceptions. It's not just a digital version of the current SAT. So it's actually fairly significantly different in certain respects. We're going to get into that. Also, another possible misconception, it is taken on a computer, but it's not taken at home. The era of at-home testing has not begun yet, maybe in the future. But so the process of like going to an official test center on specific days, that's still staying the same. So like going, like, testing at Hill, for instance, the changes, it's now on a computer. All right, so how is this test different from, let me get my little pen going. How's this test different than the current test? So we've got the current test up at the top, and like right here, the digital test is right here. So in some respects, kind of similar, both have 4 sections. One thing that you might notice is like reading and writing has now, this RW means reading and writing, that's now been blended together. They're not distinct sections. The other thing is, and this is fairly significant, if you feel like doing the math and adding up the times, the digital SAT is significantly shorter, almost an hour shorter than the current SAT and also the current ACT. So that's a pretty big deal. Another big difference, and this is actually related, we'll get into that, is that the test is now adaptive. So the test changes depending on how you do. So here's an example of how this would work for the reading and writing section. So you see, like, we've got, basically part 1, part 2. So in that first module of reading and writing, everyone gets the same stuff. Everyone gets the same section. You get like basically a balanced blend of easy, medium, and hard. And there's a certain threshold. If you score above that threshold on the first section, you will then be routed to the harder second set of questions, and that's for module 2. If you score below that threshold, obviously you'll go to the easier set of questions for module 2. And also, if you'll notice, just looking here, the possible scores are, so the ceiling on possible scores is pretty significantly affected by this. So like if you end up on the lower track, you can still get a good score, but you're basically maxing out around 600. It's a little bit complicated. So it's not exactly 600, but it's around there. Whereas if you're on the harder track, obviously you can score all the way up to the maximum, which is 800. Okay, so sorry, a lot of text here, but this is College Board's explanation of basically why they went adaptive. So I'm going to read this, but I'm going to read it fast. So in contrast to linear testing, so that's like testing the way that it is now. In contrast to linear testing, where students often end up being given questions that are either too easy or too hard for them, adaptive testing personalizes question delivery according to what the test delivery platform learns about a given student during the exam. And then important thing. So because of this tighter targeting to student achievement level, adaptive testing allows for shorter tests than their linear counterparts. Okay, so in other words, like the fact that it's shorter and the fact that it's adaptive are two sides of the same coin. I had like some people be like, it's weird that it's adaptive. I hate that. It freaks me out. But they like that it's shorter. Unfortunately, you can't, in this case, have one without the other, because the fact that it's adaptive means that they can kind of hone in on your skill level, so to speak, with less questions than they would normally, which is cool. I mean, again, 50 minutes shorter, that's a pretty big difference. All right. What has changed in terms of the content? Because it has been tweaked in some ways. So on the verbal side, these big long passages that you used to get on the SAT, those dreaded long passages, those have been replaced with much shorter excerpts. There's more variety. There's things like poetry. There's never poetry. And there's also a little bit of more variety in question types. So there's questions that ask you to like sort of analyze an argument, a couple of different kind of thought processes that the current version of the test didn't really ask you to do. On the math side, it's been sort of trimmed down. It's less wordy. It's more like school math in a sense. It's a little bit closer to the ACT in some ways. So as we put here, kind of more procedural, like more sort of step-by-step, less abstract. And the calculator plays a bigger role. And we're actually going to illustrate that in a second. So one thing we want to show you is just kind of how, so I'm saying this, but like it's how the experience of it actually changes. So like what the interface looks like, what the test day experience is going to be. So Josh helpfully put together this video to walk us through it. And let me know if you can hear, Josh, let me know if the sound is working.
Hey everybody, we are going to take a quick look at Bluebook, which is College Board's digital testing platform. This is what students will use to take the digital SAT on their test day. And it's also available right now from College Board's website, so you can download it and simulate the digital SAT through one of their full-length practice tests. We're going to use this for the test preview, which is going to allow us to see how the content shows up on the new digital SAT, and also shows us some of the tools that make the testing experience unique. First, we'll jump in here to section 1, reading and writing, exactly the same as it will be on test day. The main difference here is that we no longer have full-length passages. Each reading question is accompanied by one short excerpt. And the reading and writing questions are mixed together. So you'll have a grammar question next to a vocab question, next to a reading comprehension question, all in the same section. We also have some tools available here that we can use to navigate each question more effectively. These range from a basic resizing of windows to more useful tools like striking through answer choices that we've eliminated, and even annotating information so that we can focus our attention on the information that we think is most valuable for solving the problem, and even add a note for us to reference by putting our cursor over the highlighted text. Finally, we have the ability to navigate through this section more easily by using this navigation bar here. This will show us questions that we've omitted, answered, and flagged, so that during the section or when we get to the end of the section, we can very easily see which questions we've skipped, which questions we've flagged, and which questions we've completed. The next section is going to be the math section of the digital SAT, and this is going to be very similar to the reading and writing section in that we have a lot of the same tools. Same ability to navigate through the questions. We're again going to be able to flag answers, and again going to be able to rule answer choices out that we don't think are correct. There will be some key differences. Not particularly important is this reference sheet, which is exactly the same as the one that used to accompany the old SAT at the top of the math, calc, and no calculator sections. But very interesting is this new digital graphing calculator. Now this is powered by Desmos, which some students will be familiar with, but it is a much more powerful and efficient tool particularly more efficient tool than the TI-83, TI-84 that you would have been able to use on the calculator section of the paper SAT. Here we're going to be able to use this to quickly make calculations from basic addition to multiplication and other higher order functions, to graphing equations, and even to solving more advanced systems of equations. So if we had a question that gave us two equations, we could pop them right in here and figure out the solution to this system. There will be a couple tricks to navigating this well, familiarity, of course, and even just the small trick of figuring out where exactly to put this calculator so that you can still see the question. But familiarity with it will make it an incredibly powerful tool for managing the math section of the SAT. And the final thing we should note is that, much like the paper SAT, we will have a mix of multiple choice questions and what we used to call gridden questions or student-generated questions. These are going to be pretty similar to the questions you saw in that test, with the exception of a little bit more space to include longer answers. And that's it. Hope you enjoyed this walkthrough.
Josh, thank you. Thank you. I don't know what everyone's individual reaction is to seeing that, but I have to say for myself, I think that there are a lot of things that are appealing about the interface and the way that they've set up the new testing experience. I do think it's also it's going to be something that takes a little bit getting used to. At least that's my sense of it looking at it. So I think having some experience with it before test day is super important. And the little stuff like the calculator, it's actually makes a huge difference. All right, so we've covered a lot of differences, but I want to kind of bring us back to what stayed the same, because there's a lot that stayed the same, and in some respects, the most important stuff has actually stayed the same. So there's the structure, like, okay, it's still half math, half verbal. And then more importantly, the core underlying skills have not really changed at all. So if you have strong reading comprehension, if you have a grasp of grammar rules, if you have a knack for algebra, you're going to do really well on the digital SAT, and you're also going to do really well on the current version of the test. And in fact, College Board ran a pilot of about 6,000, a little over 6,000 students before they released this. And the students in the pilot took the digital test, and they also took the paper and pencil test, and their scores were almost identical. It was like the average scores were like 241 in one group and 1241 and 1242. It was like a one point difference. So, going from paper to digital, you shouldn't really expect to see scores go up or scores go down. Your performance is going to be basically the same, or at least very similar across those tests. Okie doke.
All right, well, I will take it from here. And thank you, Sam, for the rundown on the digital SAT. And thank you all for listening to my video there. Definitely have a future in infomercials. So, although the digital SAT is top of mind for many of you, and certainly for everybody in test prep, the decision you'll actually be making if you plan on testing in the US over the next 8 or so months is whether to take the paper SAT or the paper ACT. And I know we have some fifth formers here, so this will be particularly important for you. So let's talk a little bit about those differences and to what extent they should inform your test selection. All right, so on a high level, these are somewhat similarly structured tests. Both are 4 sections, with each section running somewhere between like half an hour and an hour. And you have this sort of 50-50 verbal, say, quantitative split. Now, there is a fairly obvious distinction here, which is that ACT includes the science section. We will touch on that shortly. But the most significant difference from the perspective of a tutor who's worked with hundreds of students is the timing. So the ACT is a much faster paced test. So the difference between 49 and 70 seconds per question is the difference that you're going to feel if you're taking this test. Now, if you can manage the faster pace, there are actually a lot of advantages to the ACT. So like this shouldn't bias you too much away from it, but it is an important consideration. Another difference that's reasonably impactful is the extent to which math makes up your total score. So it is 50% of the SAT, which is a huge chunk. And for the ACT, I mean, I know science has some quantitative elements to it, but really the math is just a quarter of your score. Also, the scope of the math is a little bit different. So the SAT is much more focused on algebra, graphing, and basic stats, whereas the ACT includes those, but has more of a balance between those and other topics like geometry, pre-algebra, and like a little bit of pre-calc. But the key point here is that you are going to be able to overcome a weaker math score on the ACT more readily than you will on the SAT. Okay, this is a little bit of a weird chart to understand, but the point here is that there's this additional layer of complexity. We're talking about a math section with more breadth. We're talking about a faster paced test. But one thing that's also true, if you look at this graph, is that the ACT is a little bit more of a flexible test in terms of how many questions you can get wrong and still get a certain level score. So let's just say you were shooting for a 90th percentile math score. So you can see, thank you, Sam, you can see here that in order to hit a 90th percentile score in the ACT, you would need to have about 16 or fewer errors. Whereas on the SAT, I mean, you can see right here, you can't have more than 7 and still get into the 90th percentile. So that's also going to make a pretty big difference. And you're going to have to weigh that against some of these other considerations like breadth of the math, like pace of the test. All right, and now the infamous ACT science section. So tons of students are turned off by this, at least the ones who don't feel that confident about their science skills. And it's really important to know that you do not need to have taken chemistry, physics, or bio to do well on this section. It is really not a test of your science knowledge. Science is the context, of course, but really this is a test of locating information, both in text and particularly from visual displays of data. So like graphs and charts. And then it's about interpreting the displays of data and then drawing inferences from those to solve the problems they give you. So like an example would be this question down below. It's definitely a science context, which should be pretty obvious to most of you, but it's really just asking, as the numbers increase in that one column, what happens to the numbers in the other column? You don't need to know anything about Zia Marina or CSAP, as we promise you. So again, it is a test where science is the context, but science is really not required to do well in this section. So takeaways. Most important, like we said, the ACT is a faster paced test. So you are going to feel that is the most significant difference. Also, the SAT score is heavily influenced by the two math sections. And of course, performance there is heavily influenced by algebra, stats, and graphing skills. And the ACT has this, science section, but it does not really test science. Now, as you saw with the difference between grading on the math sections, the picture is a little bit more complex than this. So these facts should inform your decision, but nothing is going to be as important as actually taking these tests yourself to see how you perform on them. It's a comparison between those scores, which could be practice SAT and a practice ACT, could be your PSAT score and an ACT, but that's really what's going to inform the decision and be most useful for figuring out which test you want to focus on. All right, we have another comparison here. This is our final comparison. It's between the two different scoring systems the test use, which look very different. So when we're saying compare your scores, this is kind of what we mean. They are different systems. SAT is at a 1600, ACT is at a 36. But as you can see here, and there are lots of other concordance tables available online, you can directly compare these scores and get a sense of, for instance, how to compare a 1040 here to a 19. Right? Both of these are 50 percentile scores, which means that If you have a 1040 on the SAT, you're performing roughly equivalent to that if you get a 19 on the ACT. This is also useful if you're thinking about score gains. So ACT going up 2 points feels like very little because it's only 2 points, but you have to also keep in mind that, it's equivalent to maybe like a 60-point jump on the SAT. So progress is also going to feel a little bit different. None of this should inform which test you choose. And then also the breakdown's a little bit different as well. So SAT's total score it's 2 800-point section scores added together. ACT's 36 score that you get is an average of the 4 sections, which are also all out of 36. So, interesting to know, but not a good reason to choose one test over the other. So at this point, I am going to recruit Sam here to help with an audience poll. So we get this very common question about whether these tests are curved. And we kind of want to know what you guys all think. So are these tests curved? Are they not? Do you have no clue? So let us know what you think.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah.
It's kind of,
That's some consensus.
I wish everyone could watch these results come in there. I feel like I'm watching a game show.
Oh, catching up here.
Wow. Okay. Okay.
All right. Actually, so the yeses and the nos are pretty close here. Not that many no clues. So it's a bit of a complicated answer. So the correct answer is
all
actually,
right. Yeah.
You guys are all right. And presumably the no clue answers are right by default. So the correct answer is kind of. So usually when we think of a curve, we're thinking of test results adjusted to the performance of students in a class, right? Like the whole class takes a test, depending on how the best student does and where most of the middle students fall and so on. Like this, the results are adjusted. The SAT and the ACT results are not impacted by the performance of other testers on that day. The scales are set in advance of the test day. So there's not a curve in that sense. However, for consistent scores across different SAT administrations or ACT administrations, the tests do make adjustments for test sections that have slight variance in difficulty. Because as you'd imagine, it's very hard to dial in the difficulty so that one math section in 2017 is just as hard as another math section in 2021. You can kind of see this on this chart. Now this is a really dramatic example, so please don't get freaked out. But if you were to take the March 2018 math section of the SAT and the October 2018 section of the math SAT math and got 5 questions wrong, on the one test you'd have a 770 and on the other you'd have a 710. That's a pretty big difference, but the thing you want to keep in mind is that as far as the SAT saw it, the one test was actually much harder than the other, or at least the one math section. So the reason you get a 770 in March is because that test was, they considered, very difficult. So you get a couple questions wrong, they're not going to penalize you as much. Whereas in October, they felt the test was a little bit easier. And so getting 5 questions wrong is something that they felt was not as hard to do. So you're going to lose more points for it. So to that extent, there is a curve, but it's not the sort of curve you think of when you think of curves that are affected by the performance of other people on that test day. All right, this all kind of segues nicely into the very important topic of setting expectations. So I'm going to pass this back over to Sam to take it from there.
Thanks, Josh. Sorry, I jumped the gun there. Yeah, so I think I realize that people in the audience are probably coming at this from a lot of different directions and kind of, students come to this process from a lot of different places. And I don't know if some people have this question in the back of their minds right now, but the most common question I get from parents at the beginning of this process is something like this. It's basically like, my son or daughter is an excellent student, 4.0, 3.9, whatever student, A's in math, so on and so forth. And they just it doesn't get reflected in their test scores. Like their math score is slightly above average. Why isn't it excellent? I get this all the time. It's a super understandable question. The answer is maybe a little bit frustrating, is that the discrepancy between school performance and testing is a little bit by design. These tests are not designed to mimic GPA or measure the same things as GPA. If they did, they would be redundant. We wouldn't need them. I mean, some people will say we don't need them anyway, but like it would be more obvious. Like it would truly just be, GPA would be a better measure of that. But it's not, because it actually tests a different set of skills, and in that sense is very different from a test that you would take in school for a regular class. So there is overlap. Like you do need certain content knowledge for the SAT or ACT. You need like the slope of a line or something like that. But there's all of these other skills that get heavily called upon: flexible thinking, abstract reasoning, stress management, time management, which are things that are important for school, but not nearly to the degree, I would argue, as they are for these tests. So what's the upshot of that? Well, if you're at a place where, if your starting point is not where you want it to be, if you feel like it's not representative of what you're really capable of, don't stress. Improvements happen all the time. Big improvements happen. It's absolutely possible. It's not easy. It takes a lot of work, especially the big ones. But I mean, Josh and I have seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students make like pretty astonishing strides. Just to kind of ground expectations, it is obviously the case that the farther you are from your goal score, the more work it's going to take. And there's no guarantees. That's just, that is unfortunately how it is. But again, improvement, where you're starting from is not necessarily your fate at all. Okay. That was a lot. So practical steps. Where do you go from here? Well, there's a couple of principles that we like to sort of articulate to parents to guide this process. One of them is plan to test multiple times. Plan to. It may not end up being the case. Maybe you knocked it out of the park and don't have to do it again. Maybe you decide ultimately after one that you're not going to submit scores, whatever. But plan for 2 to 3. There are 2 big reasons for this. One is scores tend to go up. 2 out of 3 students who take the SAT a second time, their scores go up. The stats are almost identical for the ACT. And that's just the national average. That's not factoring in, if you're someone who's doing preparation in between tests, then that number, you can expect that number to be higher. The other big reason is super scoring. Very exciting. So what's super scoring? Well, super scoring is a college by college policy, and it's basically how they look at test scores. So not everyone does it. A lot of schools do, not all of them. Penn State, for instance, like doesn't. But so what is super scoring? Super scoring is when colleges look at your best sections across multiple tests instead of your best test. What does that mean? Well, if you look at our little imaginary friend here, test 1, test 2, their best test was test 2. Okay, so if there's no super scoring, you submit test 2. But their best math section was test 1. Their best verbal section was test 2. So if the school that you're submitting these scores super scores, if I said that a little wrong, you would combine those and get the following. All right. So again, second reason for why planning to test multiple times is, generally speaking, a good idea. So how do we get started? As Josh said, really the first step is kind of the easiest. Get that baseline, figure out which test you're stronger at. If you have a PSAT score, you can use that and take a practice ACT to compare to that, or you could just take a practice test of both. Also factor in just the subjective experience of taking those tests. If SAT math makes you want to cry, then like probably not a good idea to take that test. Like it's not just about the numbers, it's also about how you feel and your confidence level taking those tests. Accommodations, if you have extra time for one test but not the other, that can also factor in. And then as far as when this begins, our rule of thumb is think about beginning preparation about 8 to 12 weeks before your first actual test. If you're signed up for a test like in a month and you haven't started, don't worry. It's okay. It's okay. It's totally fine. It's just like, this is a rule of thumb. I've seen it successfully done a lot of different ways. But when do you test? I'm not going to make a general recommendation on when to test. I think it's very much a personal decision, but here are some things to consider. Academic workload and APs. If you're taking 5 APs, probably not a good idea to schedule your SAT like in the middle of AP testing season. If you know the lacrosse playoffs are going on, probably not a good idea to put a whole bunch of the test prep process during that period of time. If you need scores early for recruitment, that should factor in. Early action, early decision, that's another thing. And then because the test is changing, if for whatever reason you really don't want to take the digital SAT, then that would be a good reason to move up the timeline somewhat so you can finish testing by December. So again, I have no official endorsement on what test dates are the best. I will say that starting in the summer after your 5th form year makes things a little bit tight, just in terms of like the number of tests that you've got left before early decision. It can be done. It's not like, it's absolutely not the end of the world, but I generally recommend starting a little bit before that. Okay, so not everyone is at this point, but most of you will be at this point at some stage in the future. So you've taken a test. Let's say it doesn't go exactly how you want it to go. What do? Well, don't panic. One score is one score. It was just one day. Like this happens all the time. I always get stories of like some poor unfortunate soul who like there was a weed whacker going on outside their testing center, and like I'm so sorry. Random stuff happens. You get passages that don't quite click. This, it's one day, it's 3 hours. So if it's not exactly what you want, as long as some of the fundamentals are good, as long as like if you're practicing and like, let's say you're taking practice tests and they look pretty good, it's probably okay. Just keep going. Again, people tend to get better on the second test. What else can you do if you're not happy with the scores? You could think about how you're preparing. If you have a Kaplan or a Princeton Review, like big old book in your dorm room or your child's dorm room, and it's not moving or getting cracked open, think about other ways to prepare. If videos on Khan Academy are more engaging, find a study buddy. Whatever works. But if it's not working, then change it. And then the most drastic measure, and I wouldn't normally recommend this. Sometimes it works, but I would be cautious about it, is changing your test. So going from the SAT to the ACT or vice versa. I think early on in the process, changing is pretty painless, like before you've done a lot of preparation, but if you've spent a lot of time learning one test, I normally don't recommend switching, but sometimes it's warranted. Okay, you've taken a test. You're thrilled with the scores. That's awesome. Congratulations. Do you test again? It depends. It depends. I've seen people jump up a lot and then they hit what they thought was their goal score, and then they realize that like the schools that are now within range are this whole set of schools that they never considered before, and they're like, okay, I actually want to go up a couple more points. That can happen. It really depends. It depends on the schools that you're looking at. It depends on, are you sick of this process? Maybe you just want to be done. That's fine. That's a conversation I would have with somebody like Jade, honestly. All right. That's a lot. Let's zoom out a little bit. To kind of make this a little bit simple, all of this could be kind of restated. Think about test prep like you're running a marathon. Consistency, practice. Progress isn't going to be like a simple linear trend. Like there's going to be good days and bad days. That's totally normal. If the fundamentals are good, then that's great, and it's probably going well. And I would also be remiss to not mention mental health in this context. Couple things that from my perspective as a tutor, I think apathy or anxiety. I think a lot of times students like look like they don't care, and sometimes their parents get frustrated about that. And what I've noticed is that a lot of times the kids who don't seem like they care, they're actually under the surface, they're quite stressed about it. So I think keep that in mind. I'll also understand again that this is a process. It's not just going to be like a simple, easy march to 1600. And lastly, this score does not define your child in a number of different ways. It doesn't define their intelligence. It also doesn't determine ultimately their college chances. Like there's a lot of factors at play here. All right, to wrap this up, a couple of suggestions about resources. Most of you probably know Khan Academy. They have a partnership with College Board, so they have some materials for the SAT. Their digital SAT materials are like a little bit lacking at the moment, but I kind of expect that will change, but we'll see. Reddit, I don't know, you may not know Reddit, your kids know Reddit. It's like an online message board community, and it's one of the most kind of vibrant test prep communities, just a bunch of high school kids who like share tips and resources and kind of support each other. There's also the official sites, College Board, ACT. They've got high quality materials, but there's not that much of it. And then there's books like the Princeton Review tome that I referred to earlier. I've never actually seen those work successfully, but you know, with the right kid, it's theoretically possible. There's also some much less well-known books, these indie books. These are produced by like a tutor or a set of tutors, usually on pretty narrow topics like ACT science, something like that. They're actually really good. A lot of them are really good. They take some dedication to kind of really work through, but there's some good stuff there, especially if you're focusing on like a certain part of the test. And then higher investment, working with a tutor, that can take a number of different forms. There's classes like the Hill class, there's one-on-one tutoring, and there's blends of, you know, classes and one-on-one, self-prep and classes, et cetera, et cetera. We made it. Okay. So on that note, we're going to turn it over to y'all, and then, but in case I forget to mention, if you want to write this down, if you don't get the chance to get a question in or something occurs to you afterwards, so Tara, again, is the normal person who talks to the parents and not the non-nerd. I would direct, that's her email. Don't hesitate to reach out. She also like will do consults, take a look at test scores, all for free, all that good stuff. All right.
Yeah, let me just jump in because I know some of you
Yeah.
were filtering some questions in through the chat as we were going along, and that's great because if you're like me, if I'd waited till the end of the presentation, I would have forgotten what I was going to ask in the first place, right? So I always like to give you the option of asking questions as they pop up. And Jade, thank you. I know she was popping in and answering some of those for us, but a couple of things just to add to what is already in the chat. So somebody asked if the ACT is going digital also, and if so, when? And Sam and Josh, you guys may have some information on this. The information that I know on it is that yes, maybe. That, you know, there is talk about that happening. There's not a definitive date as to when it is happening, but they have stated that when it does go digital, ACT will always continue to offer a paper option of the test. So that might be a little bit different. But like, as far as I know, and I don't know if you guys have heard anything different, there's not a definitive date as to when that would launch.
Yeah, they're keeping their what's the expression, cards close to the vest. There's no doubt that they're looking very closely at the rollout of the digital SAT and kind of gauging how successful it is and also how people respond to it. When the SAT changed in 2016, it lost a good bit of market share temporarily to the ACT. So there's like a whole business angle to this that's not worth getting into at the moment. But yeah, Tara's right. I think we don't know. It's quite possible. They're definitely working on it. But no timeline, no official or public timeline.
A couple of
To your point, Stan. I mean, it seems like the ACT is very unlikely to make any changes for the upcoming year. So I think anyone who's testing next year,
you guys are
regular ACT, and largely just because, rather cynically, they don't want to disrupt. They want to be the safe choice while the SAT changes. I mean, almost certainly. All right, sorry, Tara.
No, that's okay. That's all right. A couple of the other questions that were in the chat, just so that everybody saw the answer. Somebody had asked if we were sharing a recording of this presentation, and yes, it will be shared. Jade will make sure that everybody has access to that. And another question that Jade had jumped in and answered about the super scoring, does it apply to ACT? It's similar to SAT. You'll just kind of have to go off of what your counselor, their knowledge, or sometimes you can Google it and see. Some schools do, some schools don't. Typically the majority super score, but there's going to be those that do not for either SAT or ACT. And then the last question that I saw that was in there so far was, does a student decide whether or not to submit scores, or do schools automatically have visibility? And also, do the schools accept either test? And Jay cautioned that most of the schools do accept either SAT and ACT, and that scores are not visible. However, when you go to register for the test, there is a way you can select to automatically release your scores. We never recommend doing that. I don't think any counselors that we work with recommend doing that, but that would be the only time that schools would, get those automatically released, was if you select that on when you register for the test. But always make sure, I would say, if you guys, well, you guys can chime in too, do not do that, because if something wonky happens like Sam described, and we have had kids that just something weird happened on test day and they didn't do so well, you don't want those scores automatically shooting off to the schools.
Yeah, I think it's also, just to restate a point made there, the SAT and the ACT have, different schools, because of old regional trends, tend to get more SATs than ACTs in certain parts of the country, but schools have treated those two tests equally for quite a long time now. The only difference you can see sometimes is some schools will super score one test and not the other. And again, college counselors are a great resource for that. So they can let you know what makes the most sense for your target schools. All right, so any other questions?
You're also filled with knowledge this evening now.
You're just so thorough.
Well, and definitely, feel free, you could go on our website. There's tons of information. If you have additional questions about anything, please do not hesitate to reach out. Happy to have conversations, answer any questions you may have. Also, if your child has only done an SAT but hasn't tried an ACT or vice versa, a full length version of an SAT, we have plenty of practice tests we're happy to share. If that's something that they would like to do, and those are all, complimentary as well. So don't hesitate to reach out to us.
We do have one more question that came in here, which is how soon after prep should students test? And there's probably several things you can say here. Sam, what would your advice be?
I guess it depends what it means. I think what we had said was prepping for 8 to 12 weeks before their first test is like our rule of thumb. So yeah, maybe the question is different, but that's the way I'm reading it.
Well, I can jump in on this too, because the analogy we use of training for this test, like you train to run a marathon, you don't want to train for something or practice for this test and then have a big 3-4 week gap before the actual test date. So you should do prep up until your official test date to have the best chance of being successful. So you think about all of the different aspects that the kids are working on with prep, making sure they're solid with the content, making sure they're solid with strategies, timing, pacing, all of that. You want that leading right into their test date. Just as if you were getting ready for a race, you practice the whole way up until that official test date is there.
Yeah, so from start to finish, the recommendation is, 8 to 12 weeks before your first test is ideal. Test, 2 or 3 times, enough to secure a good super score for the schools that you'll be able to submit that to. And don't take a break if you don't have to. I mean, a break waiting for test results is fine, but like any other skill, you can get a little bit deconditioned if time passes. So, once you're kind of in the swing of testing, try to just bang it out, get it all done. Then we have, when should they take the first test?
Yeah. So it really depends. So like consider your larger schedule and obligations. The short answer is, either the fall, for most people, either the fall or spring of their junior year.
There's just one other additional thing, not incredibly important, but there's a gap in the testing year. 2 gaps really, but if you're thinking about fall testing and spring testing, in the fall, the ACT and the SAT both end in December, in the first 2 weeks of December. That's the last one of the year. And then the first SAT of the next year is in March. The ACT comes a little sooner in February, but it does mean, like, if you're testing SAT, and this year it's going to be weird because you go from paper to digital, but either way, you're going to have one test first Saturday in December, and then one test, or your next test, at the very start of March. So that's one of the longer gaps between tests that occurs during the year. It's not a big deal if you want to take advantage of it, but what we tend to see is a lot of people kind of treat the fall as a testing window. And then, March kind of starts the next SAT testing window, which is like March, May, June. All right. Additional question here. Would you suggest signing up for both at the same time?
If you're talking about ACT and SAT, signing up for both of those, typically our recommendation is no, not as an official test. Would rather students try a practice test of each, and then we could have a conversation to figure out which would potentially be the better test path and stick with one test over the other.
Does a large time gap between the time that you take the test and when you apply for college affect your chances at college admissions? This is an easy one. No, it doesn't. At some point test scores expire, but it's like 10 years or something.
Is it
So like
10 years?
so basically just like if your best score was your like the summer after sophomore year, like that's not too soon. That's perfectly fine. If you're able to kind of finish the process early, that's not going to be counted against you.
All right. Any other questions? These are great, by the way. These are really good questions.
Mhm. All right,
You
well,
know, one thing I was going to say, thinking about that last question, and it's not, not particularly interesting. It's one thing that we don't do a lot of, because a lot of our work is with students heading off to college, and also some students heading off to graduate school, because we do some graduate testing. But transfer students, I assume, Sam, I mean, that long period of time where tests are still valid, I assume a lot of transfer students, when they're transferring, will also include those SAT scores or ACT scores from, I mean, potentially 5 years earlier. So just kind of another consideration.
Also, this is a little bit different, but something worth mentioning is that it looks extremely likely that you'll be able to super score across the paper SAT and the digital SAT. So if you were to have scores in the winter with the paper version, and then you've kept going, you took, March or a later test, a digital test, you can do the super scoring process, assuming the college has that policy.
Yeah, that's a really important good point. So if you choose to test in the fall and you take your last SAT in December and you're not satisfied with that score, but maybe one of the section scores was pretty strong, you don't feel like you're starting from scratch going and taking the next March test. A lot of the content will carry over, as Sam talked about earlier, and you're very likely to be able to super score it. We're not certain. A lot of colleges have announced that they will do that, but in any case, don't be too stressed about that change. All right. Well, I mean, it looks like that's no new questions have come in.
All right. Well, we'll be around. You can find me on Sundays too. If you're in Pottstown. No, thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it. We're big fans of Hill, and it's really great to have the opportunity to talk to you guys about this stuff. It's a confusing time, but it's also an exciting time. So again, if any other questions come up or you guys want to chat, contact Tara, go to our website, any of the above.
Have a good night, everybody.